Hey, everybody, and welcome to Tactics of Deception Protecting Trust and Purpose. My name is Alethe Denis, and I'm a senior security consultant on the red team here at Bishop Fox. We're going to waste no time getting into the presentation this morning. And first, we're going to start with kind of a crazy story. This usually is thought of something that impacts businesses, but it actually impacts a lot of individuals as well. I had a friend who nearly lost $15,000 in about 90 minutes, and they knew better the entire time. And all of this was perpetrated over the phone, not using any technology, any AI, any deep fakes, just purely principles of persuasion. And we'll get into discussing more about that a bit later. Again, my name is Alethe. I am a senior security consultant specializing in social engineering, red teaming, and adversarial simulation here at Bishop Fox on the red team. I am one of about 20 operators on the red team currently, and I've trained Army Special Operations personnel and consultants at Fort Bragg on how to develop pretext and adversarial simulation. I also focus on how attackers exploit trust, urgency, and process gaps in high stakes environments, as well as critical infrastructure and the Fortune 500. This is something that I take a lot of pride in, knowing the psychology and how to essentially think like an attacker, that adversarial mindset. And my work in this area helps organizations strengthen against human decision making under pressure to reduce that manipulation driven risk. Today, we're going to be talking about the human attack surface, tactics of deception with some real world examples, and why traditional security controls fail, some mitigation strategies, and finally some key takeaways, and then we'll move into questions. So, first, let's talk about people and the human attack surface. Spend a little time on this today just to set the stage. Humans are not weak, we are wired for trust. This is a survival tactic, and attackers use fear and urgency as well as authority to create a narrow tunnel of compliance, pushing people to cooperate with what their requests are or the actions that they hope people take. People have no time to reflect, verify, or disengage, and so they get sucked into a cycle of compliance. And what that looks like is pressure around urgency, sometimes fear based pretexts, and it encourages that state of decision paralysis where people are not able to think clearly or analyze what they're being asked to do. This type of attack is extremely compelling to the target. It puts them in a state of cognitive overload in some cases. Usually that looks like something similar to the MFA fatigue attacks, where people are getting notifications over and over and over again that their MFA provider needs them to authenticate access. And usually people will just comply and accept that if they're receiving a bunch of alerts because they think it must be legitimate. But for the most part, people trust because we as a society have been behaviorally conditioned to trust in order to cooperate as a community and as a society overall. So people figured out very early on that if they cooperated, shared skills, shared resources, that they were more likely to survive. And this trust is essential for everyone to be able to live in a society and cooperate together as a community. So if you didn't trust anyone, I know the term usually is trust no one, but if you didn't trust anyone, you couldn't eat the food that's in your fridge, get out and drive your car, trusting that your car is safe and that the people around you are going to follow the rules of the road. All of these basic everyday things that we take for granted, our use of those things and our ability to go out into the world is purely based on our trust of the other people in our environment making the resources that we use and interacting with us on a daily basis. If we were to trust no one, we would be isolated with no access to resources, no way to use even public utilities. So, this trust is extremely important to our survival and our ability to work together as a community and as a society. And it's something that is not weakness, it is a behavior that we have learned in order to survive, essentially. So, how do attackers exploit this? Attackers are typically using one or more of the psychological principles of influence. This is something that was made popular by a book by Robert Cialdini called The Psychology of Persuasion, and it's something that's shared quite a bit by social engineers, especially those who are wanting to get into this as a job and curious about how to develop these skills. Reciprocity is the idea that if I did something for you, you're indebted to me. And it's often used in romance scams, fake refunds, or charity fraud. The commitment and consistency principle essentially says that if I've said yes before in the same conversation, I'm more likely to continue to say yes, to remain consistent with that previous action. So if I'm asked for my name, where I work, and some brief non sensitive details about my job, then I'm more likely to comply with answering sensitive questions later on in the conversation because I need to remain consistent with my past action of trusting this person and remain committed to that line of trust. Otherwise, it's very uncomfortable for people to break out of that and say, you know what, where did you say you were calling from? And so that commitment and consistency principle is very effective at encouraging people to continue to comply once they've begun to feel comfortable with somebody. Social proof is the idea that everyone else is doing it, so it should be safe for me to do it. And oftentimes, attackers will offer information like, well, I've talked to everybody else already and they've complied, so you're the last person on my list, for example, to give that person a sense of comfort that everyone else is taking part in the activity. And so, therefore, it must be safe. Authority, oftentimes we think of authority as somebody impersonating a CEO, like CEO text messages, asking for gift cards and things that are similar to that. But sometimes authority can look like the attacker impersonating somebody who is the expert in the situation. So, for example, if they pose as the IT person, then usually they can command the authority in the conversation around IT related actions that they want that person to take. Liking is extremely dangerous. People often trust people that they like. And so this is also very effective in sales for people who are likable and who are easy to talk to. They make people feel comfortable. And that liking principle is very much leveraged in romance scams where the attacker can build rapport by mirroring values, hobbies, and that person's background. Scarcity, this is the idea of act fast, limited time offer, and in scams and social engineering attacks, we often see this as, this will only take a few minutes, or I need to get this done, or you won't get on the list to get whatever the incentive is, or you're first on my list, and if you wait till later, then there'll be many more people in front of you. That idea that a resource is scarce makes it infinitely more desirable to the person that is being targeted. And finally, unity. This is a more recent principle that was added in the most updated copy of the book. And it's something that I think was absolutely missing, that idea that we are in this together. And this is something that I use a lot when I am performing social engineering, but also when I am engaged with people who I would like to build rapport with, even in the sense of a business transaction. You want to create that emotional bond and that shared identity, especially in the longer term relationship, building a relationship based on trust and the idea that we're in this together. This is something that is often used maliciously during long cons, like pig butchering, for example, where somebody will pose as a friendly investment tip provider and then slowly move the relationship into this person sharing or transferring money or Bitcoin to the attacker. Let's dive into some of the tactics of deception around some real world examples and some numbers. So, in the great landscape of trust, deception, and threats that many of us are facing, we're seeing these losses driven primarily by manipulation of people and not systems. Over 850,000 complaints were reported in 2024, with losses over $16 billion, which is roughly a 33% increase over the numbers from 2023. And I'm sure that that has only continued to skyrocket. The types of crimes by loss have been related to primarily investment fraud. Then, secondly, business email compromise. Tech support fraud, which I mentioned earlier, is on a smaller scale, but still in the billions in measured losses. And it's important to note romance scams because these are extremely compelling and they are unfortunately still very common because people essentially want to believe the con and to remain consistent with their past decision to believe that this person who's contacted them is a famous movie star or is somebody that's very likable and wants their best interests or wants to form a long-term relationship with them. It's very tough for people to disengage from that created, fabricated reality that they have in their mind, and then to be inconsistent with their past decisions and accept that they are being scammed. And so they continue to just send money over and over again to this person, wanting to buy into or believe this dream of this genuine relationship with this person and that what they're promising, whether that's they're going to come to the country where that person's living and actually have a physical relationship with them going forward, or that they can provide access to that person if they're supposedly a famous movie star or someone else that they're impersonating. That dream is more desirable than breaking into the reality that they are being manipulated and scammed out of usually thousands of dollars. This landscape of fraud also has developed further into cryptocurrency, leveraging this as a payment, and it's become a fraud vehicle for hundreds of thousands of transactions, meaning that people are going after crypto as a payment method rather than gift cards or cash because it's much harder to trace. Ransomware has remained the leading threat to US critical infrastructure, with over 3,000 complaints reported in 2024. And unfortunately, people over the age of 60 have suffered the most losses of any age group, totaling almost $5 billion. And this is because those people are unfortunately not as aware as some of the newer and emerging generations as to what a scam looks like, how they have been approached being suspicious rather than genuine. And this has become a key enabler of people being successful in creating those romance scams, creating that investment fraud, and encouraging these people to essentially comply with being manipulated and extorted. So let's get back into our first story. $15,000 almost lost in about 90 minutes. How did this even happen? Mostly because this person's trust was hijacked under pressure. And what this looked like was an individual received a call. It came in on their own personal cell phone. It was spoofing the number of a trusted banking institution and their customer service line. And the person on the other end of the phone was impersonating a customer service person from an area in the world that made sense in the context of the pretext and the call that was being placed. They got a hold of this person in the middle of a busy day when they were distracted, manipulated them to believe that their identity had been impersonated by another person walking into a local bank branch. They said somebody walked into a local bank branch, they had them on surveillance camera. They looked dramatically different from the person who was legitimately being targeted, and they needed this person to come down to the bank branch immediately to prove their identity by withdrawing and verifying funds using their ID because this supposed impersonation had taken place with a false ID. During the conversation, this person knew that this sounded suspicious. And so they tried to disengage from the call, but the attackers blocked their ability to make outbound calls by repeatedly and persistently calling the targeted person back, isolating them from help, cutting off their ability to contact of the legitimate bank number, and then moving to pressure this person to take action immediately by saying that they would be part of the fraud if they didn't take action to verify their ID immediately. They then encourage this person to leave the office, go to the bank, and try to withdraw $15,000. At the first bank branch, that was impossible because they didn't have enough cash on hand to make a withdrawal of that size. And so this person left the first bank branch and went to a second branch while the attacker was on the phone with them, withdrew $15,000, even though they felt like none of this made sense and they're clearly aware of psychological principles. They were trapped in that paralysis and unable to make decisions on their own because of the extreme pressure, the repetition, the cognitive overload, and this power of authority that this person had in the context of the conversation, claiming to be somebody on the fraud investigators team from that bank. Eventually, this person was sitting in a car holding $15,000 in cash and being asked to then put this money into a crypto transferring application and send it to the attacker. And it was at this point that they were finally able to break out of this loop of compliance and to reach out for help and able to go back into the bank and redeposit their funds. But at two bank branches, they allowed this person to attempt to withdraw the money and did not question anything that was happening to them over the phone or why they were there or what they were doing and just allowed this to happen. So going back into the bank, they were able to explain what was going on, redeposit the money, and there was no ultimate loss. But this human side of the scam economy is frightening, and it's across so many industries that we see altered invoices, fake leadership approvals, and urgent vendor or payment requests being among the most common entry points. Phishing and spoofing, nearly 200,000 complaints, and over $70 million in reported losses. This is still the number one entry point by complaint volume, but we also have to understand that not all complaints are reported. So this number is probably a lot smaller than what it is in reality. Even when we're talking about business email compromise, closing in on $3 billion in losses and over 21,000 complaints. This is a fraction of the number of incidents because people are genuinely embarrassed when they are a victim of this type of attack, and most go unreported. Same goes for the common attack adaptions across industries like fake vendor portal resets, fake MFA prompts, and the AI voiced calls posing as IT or help desk. These are common and commonly unreported. So this number is again probably smaller than the reality, with tech support and call center fraud at nearly 1.5 billion in losses due to help desk scams that target people's trust in IT as the authority and the expert in the situation. And confidence and romance scams, again, at 672 million lost across nearly 18,000 complaints. I'm betting that's also very underreported. And these, again, are numbers that are coming from the FBI and their most recent available report on this. Most people don't reach out to the FBI, they swallow the loss and the embarrassment and they move on. So these numbers are probably much smaller than the reality of the loss. And attackers are continuing to leverage this emotional manipulation and the artificial time constraint with urgency and pulling the exact same levers that they have been for decades, just using modern technology and the AI voiced calls. For example, this one is more well known, but it is worth diving into. 25 million plus was lost when a deep fake was able to convince a worker in Hong Kong that they were authorized to make a very large financial transfer out of the organization. How is this even possible? This person originally received a phishing email, something that most people don't know about that particular case. They were asked to take action through a phishing email. They flagged it and then asked to get on a call and were able to get on a phone call with people who they believed to be leadership in another country. So, human deception, the accuracy for high quality video deepfakes, their ability to detect whether a deepfake is a deepfake and not the genuine human is less than 25%. So, less than 25% of people were able to distinguish a deepfake from a real video call. In 2025, a study also found that only 0.1% of participants correctly identified all fake and real media that was shown to them. So people are much more likely to believe fake media and fabricated content than we really want to accept. That's nearly 100%. 70% of people say that they are not confident that they can tell the difference between real and cloned voices. And 68% of deepfakes are now described as nearly indistinguishable from the genuine media artifact. The human element is involved in approximately 60% of all breaches, meaning that while humans are not essentially the weakest link, they are being approached as the entry point to over 60% of the breaches that happen. And those technical security controls around the people are either not in place or they're being bypassed by humans who are not sticking to proper procedures and processes around identity verification and authentication of a request. In the case of our employee in Hong Kong, they asked for the video call. They followed the proper procedure, but they likely went out of band to make that connection using either a service or an application that wasn't specifically approved for that callback. So they initiated the voice call. The employee received a Zoom call that looked like it was originating from the UK, where their bosses were and the people who were authorized to make this request for this money to be moved. All the participants, and there were five, were deep fakes. Every one of the five individuals on the Zoom call with this employee were a deep faked executive or leader within the company. These five people who were deepfakes then told this individual that they should transfer the $25.6 million to a vendor account, provided that vendor account, and said that it was confidential and that this acquisition could not be shared outside of this group of people, then isolating this person away from getting verification, asking for help, or going beyond just this callback to verify that the funds should be transferred. They replicated the mannerisms and voices of the real executives with stunning accuracy, according to reports, and Hong Kong police called it a sophisticated, highly rehearsed deception. This was, again, a few years ago, so things have gotten even more realistic and compelling since then. The victim didn't doubt the meeting because there were visual trust cues. They did a really good job, the attackers, of appearing to be the genuine people responsible for finances at this organization. And this only underscores the rising weaponization of deepfakes, especially in financial fraud, where 5 deepfakes on a video call, when the employee does everything right from a procedural standpoint, convinced one human to transfer almost $26 million out of an organization to who knows where, and they were unable to get that back. So, why do traditional security controls fail? First off, familiarity bias. We as people oftentimes trust patterns and things that we've seen before, people that we know, and we want to believe that what we are seeing is genuine and to trust that. It's very uncomfortable for us to challenge somebody that we know, that we're supposed to trust, and that we're supposed to be friendly with to prove that they are who they say they are. Deception also happens, or detection also happens after the impact. So after the mistake is made, the pain is felt, the money is gone. That is typically when our tools are detecting the damage and not at the point where that decision pressure happens. And that is a really risky moment for us to be aware and able to detect potential deception, manipulation, and have the ability to ask for help or to corroborate the request and verify it. It happens oftentimes days or months before the impact is realized. Verification also gets skipped under time pressure. So, where attackers are able to leverage that artificial time constraint and really push to get things done quickly because, it's a sensitive issue, it needs to get completed today, we only have a few minutes before the close of business. Those types of artificial time constraints can create pressure that encourage people to bypass the standard operating procedure and the protocols that are in place to protect against this kind of attack. And when people say they are too busy and they're just trying to be helpful and they just want to move from one work task to the next, that's usually where we see people fail to identify when they're being manipulated or to at least follow the procedure that would prevent a compromise. There's a pattern of small exceptions becoming the new normal. Security is difficult. It is tough to implement across an entire organization, and a lot of people resist the extra steps added to procedures to make them more secure and to require that verification step, like a callback to a number that is known to the organization, or looping in a manager or two managers to verify larger transactions are authentic rather than just getting the job done. So no alarms get triggered when the behavior slowly starts to drift out of compliance with the expected procedures. And oftentimes leadership aren't even aware that the general workforce is bypassing a lot of the security controls and verification steps that have been put into place to minimize this risk. So that risk accumulates silently and without the awareness of leaders over time as people adapt to going around or bypassing procedures, security controls, and the precautions that have been put in place at the business. Also, we have too much faith in technology. I am aware of a lot of organizations where the common employee believes that endpoint protection protects against everything and that they don't really have to do that much because there's phishing filtering, there's monitoring happening, there are controls in place that we should trust because technology always works, which unfortunately it doesn't, especially when we have the humans bypassing or being able to go around those controls within the course of their job to make their lives easier or to help get more work done in a limited amount of time. So attackers don't typically fight systems. They work around them by leveraging the people that they target to bypass those technical controls or to just steamroll through any of the protections in policy and procedure that a company has put in place using those manipulation tactics and the principles of persuasion to be successful. Patterns in social engineering attacks, once you start to see these patterns, you'll start noticing them everywhere. Most attackers are going to ask people to stay on the line, don't hang up, and try to isolate their victims on a call, blocking the chances that they can verify a story. They'll also jam the line by making calls back to the person, even if they try to disconnect the call, preventing that outbound verification step, especially important to employees that are distributed or remote and not sitting in an office where they can simply stand up and ask for help. They'll also cut off external input, meaning they'll encourage the person not to trust their family. They'll encourage them to keep this quiet because it's confidential in the case of a business type campaign. And they'll try to put this person in a little bubble where they can't see anything aside from what the attacker is showing them. That tunnel vision is where victims are emotionally anchored to the attacker. There's no room for second opinions, and the authority is used to suppress the doubt that that individual may have. So they'll say something like, if anyone else contacts you, that's the scammer. Like, I'm the only person you can trust. And a lot of times they'll force their targeted human into this state of fight or flight. They'll create stress triggers, reflexive actions out of that stress, and encourage this person to be in a state where critical thinking is impossible. And victims will act fast, not smart, because they feel threatened or rushed, and they feel like they need to comply quickly to get out of this discomfort. So, what that looks like in a little bit more description from the patterns of social engineering as we see attacks coming across in a business environment is the authority impersonation, calling on behalf of a leader, compliance, or another provider. Sometimes the classic CEO fraud and impersonating somebody in leadership. The time pressure is nearly always a component. This needs to happen now, and if you try to disengage from the call, reschedule, call back, wait till later, they will amp up that pressure and just turn up the heat on creating this sense of urgency in their targeted person. The emotional manipulation usually will start with guilt and fear and urgency, and then move into more personal areas if the person does not comply, like embarrassing them or trying to create reassurance through trust and rapport and consistency with this person's past actions. Like, hey, you did this for me. So, this is the next logical step and it's okay. But that channel of isolation is probably the biggest factor that I would hope people are aware of. And when they feel like there's time pressure, emotional manipulation, and isolation, sometimes with the authority impersonation, they should very much feel compelled to disengage from whatever narrative this is, because that isolation is where most people feel like they can't ask for help and they don't have the means or methods to engage somebody who can help them verify that this request is genuine. And it is one of the most effective tactics because it does often mirror normal workplace dynamics, like, you're the only one that I'm trusting with this, or this is extremely sensitive and we have to keep it outside of typical channels. Those things can also make people feel very special. I have impersonated CEOs from Fortune 100 companies, called employees who don't typically interact with the CEO. And when I have said, hi, this is so and so, they have felt extremely special to be tapped by the CEO, especially when there's an opportunity for them to share about themselves about their role within the company and to seek that external validation from somebody so high up in leadership, they'll often spill all their guts and tell me just about anything because they feel like they've been handpicked and selected for something that is a, you know, scarce opportunity for them to receive that external validation. Mitigation strategies. How on earth do we stop this? First of all, mitigation strategies from a system and process safeguard standpoint, we want to create a way to flag unusual activity that leans more into monitoring and detection, things that we can hopefully automate, but have real analysts, humans looking at to interpret the data. We want to look for things like odd hours of access, large data transfers, and unexpected permission changes. Also, early detection stops compromised accounts before the damage can spread. We'll also want to require a second check on high stakes actions, meaning payment changes, wire transfers, vendor updates, and access approvals all need to go through a second set of approval, and a callback should be enforced. I get stopped a lot when organizations require either a management personnel to sign off on a request, or they require a manager to provide the approved callback number for the employee that I am impersonating, and they will only call that number as provided by that person's manager. So it's essentially validation by the manager that that person, the employee requesting the password reset or whatever it is, actually requested that, and then going the extra step to provide a valid callback number for that person that is recognized to be owned by that person by the organization. This callback chain, a separate message, and a second set of eyes breaks the chain of attack. It pulls the employee who is being asked to do the action out of the responsibility of saying no. And it puts the onus on process rather than the individual to accept the guilt for saying, no, I can't help you. And that is something that is absolutely vital that organizations empower their employees to point to a policy, point to a sign that says, I'm sorry, I cannot proceed without verifying you. This is why. And them not physically be able to proceed without getting the information from a manager or confirming a PIN code. I've had several clients that have a PIN code that is shared by IT to a manager, and then that PIN code is then shared from the manager to the employee, and the employee has to then confirm that PIN code back to IT to request their password reset, for example. We also want to assume voice and video can be faked. AI can now clone voices and generate realistic video of people that you know and trust, as most of us know, but being able to walk into a conversation assuming that it's fake is something I don't think most people do currently. Also, any urgent request involving money or access needs verification through a channel you initiate, not the one that the request came in on. And to go a step further, you can ask a person who you suspect maybe not genuinely themselves, or just get into the habit of asking whoever it is that you're talking to on video to hold up a number of fingers in front of their face to break that deep fake filter over the top of their genuine face and to validate that they are visually who they say they are. Mitigation steps continued along that system and process safeguard theme. We want people ultimately to slow down. And if something feels like it's not the normal way, if they're getting a request to do something over the phone and it typically comes by email, to hesitate and to trust their instincts. I don't like to say trust your gut because I feel like that's not a valid sentiment. Trusting your gut is actually pattern recognition that you've developed over your experience, over your lifetime. So you should trust your ability to recognize patterns and the fact that this doesn't fit in the current pattern for this type of request. and then build intentional friction into high stakes workflows so that those pauses are a part of the process. And those will allow people to sort of break out of that decision funnel and think critically about what it is they're being asked to do and to not make the exception just because it's easier. Finally, giving people a clear path to escalate. Everyone should know how to report something that feels weird, where that goes, and also no one should have to figure it out alone and no one should feel embarrassed by asking. So there should be no sense of shame associated with reporting something that seems suspicious or reporting when you think you might have messed up. Mitigations for people and culture, training people for real pressure, putting them in situations where you simulate attacks is helpful in doing this, and not allowing them to essentially skip click through compliance chain training and consider it done. Teach people how manipulation actually shows up and what that looks like in practice and simulate that for people so that they can start to get familiar with what it feels like and identify what it looks like. And then practice not punishment, run realistic scenarios, payment requests, IT help desk calls, executive video calls. The goal here is to create that muscle memory. Like this feels like that test. I should stop is the feeling that you want to create so you can develop employees' own pattern recognition to a point where they can easily recognize when something is not legitimate and make that pause normal, slowing things down, verify that this is the right call, and realize that people who catch suspicious requests before they become incidents should help mirror that behavior with other employees, share what they saw. People learn through stories. People are driven to learn through storytelling. And so, in the event that something does happen, being able to share that without fear, and to share it widely within the organization, that storytelling will also help to reinforce the idea of that pattern recognition and preventing these types of attacks in the future. So I think we talked about building friction into high stakes actions. You can also use out of band verification, have another method of communication, whether that's a secure messaging app, a phone call on a line that is not company owned, or insisting that all calls should be on company-owned assets and communications platforms. And then learn from the near misses. Create a safe way to share the close calls without blame, as I mentioned. You want to encourage people to share what they've learned so that it doesn't get repeated through the organization when attackers come back to target somebody else. Finally, let's talk about key takeaways, and then we will move into questions. First of all, attackers adapt. Training has to keep up, and the tactics that are changing faster than most awareness cycles need to be communicated immediately through the organization through storytelling, shared experiences, and the evolution of the security education that is being delivered at the organization. People are both the biggest risk and the biggest asset to defense. Um, this is something where I can't stress it enough. People are always going to be targeted. It is the protocols, procedures, and technology and the controls that we put around the people that are essential. And giving people the ability to point at a procedure and not take ownership of the decision making is critical to success on this side of the equation, to enforcing those secure procedures and allowing the technology controls to do what they are expected to do. Finally, security is a design problem. The best controls reduce cognitive load at the moment of decision for the person who is under attack. Pauses, second check, and escalation paths make a safe choice an easy choice. And finally, technology needs to be in the culture behind it. So tools alone are not enough. Effective defense combines technological technological controls with a culture where people ask questions and speak up. There are also humans who cognitively cannot discern when they are being manipulated for whatever reason. They don't have the capacity to see it. So, acting together with technology wrapped around humans is the only way that we're going to prevent these types of attacks with those layers of defenses, helping to reinforce the most correct decision making for the people. And now we will move into questions. The first question is, do you think due to the evolving threat landscape and the maturing of cyber, we need a taxonomy like MITRE ATT&CK to help defenders who don't have a good tradecraft reference? I think that developing a framework would be something that couldn't keep up with the evolving threat landscape. And I don't know that a framework would be as effective as approaching this from a human perspective. It's a human problem. And hopefully I answered that question, but I'll move on to the next one. Let me know if I didn't quite make it through that. Would deepfake development be classified under a form of mass int due to stylometry like techniques used in voice cloning and clone generation? Um, Refresh me on mass int. I haven't heard that one. Um, Also, next question. I'm curious what your thoughts are on using a foreign language as a pretext within the context of social engineering to create a diversion, extreme confusion, to take hold of the narrative. I don't know that using a foreign language would be compelling. I think that it would probably make the human on the other end of the phone either disengage immediately because they don't recognize or understand what they're hearing, or it would not allow the attacker to create the rapport and the trust that they need in order to command authority in that narrative. If it's a situation where that foreign language is the norm for the person who's being called, then I think that it's probably key to the success of that campaign that the attacker know their home language and is able to leverage that, especially if the person's um, trying to communicate in a language that is not their first language. That will be something that they'll find more familiar if they're able to talk with somebody who is speaking in their native language. So mass and measurement intelligence. I don't know specifically if think that the gathering of the source information for the fabrication of audio and video deepfakes is something that would be considered mass int. I look at that more as human, though we collect some source audio directly from people. If you're looking at it from the perspective of collecting it on YouTube and other online resources, then that just falls into your general OSINT category, in my opinion. Okay, on the foreign language they're sharing, I was talking about in person, not over the phone. Foreign language only works as an in person cognitive overload. Could be right there. I have not tried it myself. I typically do in person physical um, penetration tests here domestically, and I haven't run into anybody who I felt like I needed to speak to in a foreign language. It's an interesting approach, not completely dismissing it. I just haven't had the opportunity to try it. Usually I'm trying to talk as little as possible, honestly. If I can just walk in, then that's what I do. Recently on a physical, I was able to just walk in, do the head nod, make some eye contact, walk into the elevator, walk off the elevator, tailgate into the suite, and then do a lap around a sensitive floor. And it's my preference that we don't have to talk to anybody. I just kind of like to be like Beetlejuice and be invited in. How would a red team realistically test this within a large organization? So the ability to defend against social engineering attacks is something that our red team is extremely familiar with. We do a lot of work both on the standard phishing, voice phishing, and text message phishing side. Plus, we also do deepfake development, audio and video. And sometimes we get to sell the perfect engagement where we're allowed to incorporate all of those vectors as well as the deepfake audio and video into the engagement. So, how we would effectively test that as a red team is we would have a engagement where the scope and the rules of engagement allow us to use every vector for social engineering plus implement the use of a deepfake, whether that's strictly audio or a combination of audio and video. And then we will approach this as a genuine attacker would with some guardrails. So we don't actually take the $25.6 million, though that would be wonderful. But we usually stop at that point where the money will stay in the organization because we won't initiate that last step. But we see if we can get through to the point where the employee is willing to make that transfer. And then we figure out a way to um, essentially talk our way out of it in a way that doesn't raise any suspicion with the employee, to remain on the more ethical side of things. Oh, gotcha. Okay, so statistically analyzing a block of writing to identify authorship in written text. So that is something that I don't think we've reached the point of doing from an organizational standpoint. Like defenders are not implementing that, looking at the way that this person usually writes and comparing it to the requests that they're receiving is also something that not a lot of people within the organization can do because they're not familiar with how that person typically writes a request, sends an email, sends a text message. And usually those principles of persuasion and manipulation override any logical, critical thinking process where that person would say, wait a second, I got an email from this person last month. I should look at that to see if this looks similar. That's usually not a step people are taking or willing to take just because they're trapped in that funnel with all the pressure and they're making decisions emotionally rather than logically. What do I think about internet access without passing a proper identification process? Can you explain what you mean there in the context of work or personal? Are we talking about employees or just in general? I'm looking for a few more questions here. We're coming up at about 5 minutes before the end of the hour, so happy to stick around and answer questions. Otherwise, we can begin to wrap things up. The most surprising thing I've ever witnessed is the next question. I would say typically when I approach a physical pen test for a red team engagement, we do a lot of background. We look into the company, we analyze the people who work there, we figure out who we're going to be approaching, what the scenario looks like. We'll develop all the assets to support the scenario, up into including false IT companies, websites, phone numbers with, IVRs that sound like the actual IT company. So when somebody calls to check and verify that we are who we say we are, they're actually reaching what seems like an IT company. Put all this work in place, have all the right clothing, show up with all the right props. And I think the most surprising thing to me is how often I don't have to say a word, and if I do, it's something to the effect of, "Hey, will stay out of your hair and I'm allowed to pass security and go wherever I like because humans are not really wanting to like create a scene. They also don't want to challenge other people in a space where they feel like they don't have the authority to do that. Would deepfake development be in-house or utilizing demand GPU cloud resources? So both. We have methods that rely on cloud-based GPU compute renting. We also have methods that work on our own machines that have like 5090 or other GPU capabilities. And that typically just takes longer. So something that could be done in like cloud resource time frames of like 2 or 3 hours on like one GPU capable laptop could take a day. So it just kind of depends on the resources that we have, the time constraints, and whether we have the authorization to spend money on cloud compute. But that is something that we absolutely leverage. Um, of course, I want to be clear, we have been given permission to create the deepfake. We either have the source provide the source audio and video, or we have permission to collect that from public sources and attempt to emulate a real attacker and their capabilities based on what's available out in the wild. But we have a letter of authorization to test, and we have consent from the human who is being deepfaked. How have emerging technologies like facial recognition impacted your physical pen tests? They recall me saying that I did some physical ops in high security industries. Yes, that is true. So, for the most part, I haven't run into anything from the facial recognition side. A lot of times, all the really cool security is there, but there are ways that we can bypass it. Um, so Another question, have I ever dressed up as an elevator, HVAC, or Verizon technician? Me personally, no, because I don't feel like my physical appearance lends itself well to those types of pretexts. Typically, I am trying to look like just another employee, or I have impersonated somebody doing an estimate for an IT company. I've also impersonated other more boring business type pretexts rather than trying to impersonate a technician, which I don't think is very believable for my physical appearance. That said, someone else on the team, they look more like they could be from their physical appearance, an HVAC technician or a Verizon tech or an elevator repair person. They have leveraged those types of things in the past and have been very successful. Also, I also think that it depends on what you're comfortable with, and I'm more comfortable with business process than I am talking about elevator parts, for example. So, with that, don't hesitate to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any additional questions. Happy to jump in and talk about things further. Thank you so much for joining today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you with us. And we're going to go ahead and wrap it up.